Welcome to the Ancestral Cure podcast. I'm your host, Julian, and I'm here to guide you through the fascinating realm of holistic health. Join us as we bridge ancient wisdom with modern science to help you achieve optimal health, reclaim your vitality, and unlock your body's true potential. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 2 of the Ancestral Cure podcast. For today, we've got a very special guest. He is a holistic health coach. He's also gut coach, nervous system coach, and breathwork coach. Please welcome Jordan Davey. Jordan, thanks for coming on. How are you?
Thanks, mate. I'm very, very happy to be here and really looking forward to our conversation together.
Yeah, I mean, it's great because I've followed you for about, yeah, 8, 9 months now, and I think this whole like circadian biology sphere, like it is quite niche. So it's great to have a lot of people on to talk about it. And honestly, this whole stress and nervous system rabbit hole, I'm excited to learn more about it because I've obviously seen it talked about a lot, but I've not really fully gone down the rabbit hole. So yeah, it'll be great to speak about these topics.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's always great, especially for everyone listening and tuning in. Those two topics that we're going to cover, they're relevant to everyone out there. Doesn't
Mm.
matter who you are, doesn't matter how healthy you are, doesn't matter how sick you are. They are relevant to you. So it's really important information. And then obviously you get to share it with the people around you and help them as well.
Yeah, I mean 100%. That's like the beauty of holistic health is that you're becoming your own doctor instead of relying on a specific diet or a pharmaceutical, you're becoming your own doctor so that you're able to address your own issues. And I think that's really the beauty of it. But yeah, so I'd love for you to start by telling our listeners about your background. What's your background, your health journey? What led you on this whole journey to discovering holistic health, stress, trauma, emotions, circadian health? So yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, awesome. So, I mean, for me, I had a lot of my own health issues. I wouldn't necessarily say they started me on my journey. I'd always found the spiritual, the philosophical, and the psychological aspects of life super interesting. And during year 10, when I was able to pick an early CE subject, I chose psychology, and that was something that I was super interested in, and the way the brain works and neurochemistry. So that was always there, but it wasn't necessarily something that I ever thought that I was going to step into. What actually allowed me to step into it was I had a best friend at the time who I got really, really close with, and essentially our relationship was going deep into her own mental health issues at the time. And we'd spend hours on the phone each night, and I'd pretty much be counseling her and helping her through it until she got to the point, unfortunately, of attempting suicide, which was really obviously pretty shocking to go through that. And I was in year 12 at the time, so I had exams. I was playing like very high level sport, both football and basketball. And with all my health issues that had built up, so it sort of started with I got a really strong form of glandular fever, which really rocked me. And I was pretty much, I had my spleen enlarged, I think, for nearly 3.5 months. So my immune system was absolutely fried. My lymphocytes were through the roof. That also would have been partly because I had a lot of antibiotics when I was younger, growing up. And then around 16 and 17, that's when I was on Accutane, which
Mm.
is really, really strong medication that can really wreck the microbiome, really cause havoc in the immune system, and then obviously all the other sebum cells around the body. So that was probably the kickstart for it. And then when my friend did go through that, it sort of spiraled me into my own bouts of depression. And it wasn't necessarily thoughts of, oh, I want to kill myself or I want to hurt myself, anything like that. It was just this complete lack of drive and motivation and just almost this emptiness and numbness. So I sort of grinded my way through the rest of year 12, first year of uni, which I started studying psychology, cruised through that, was partying, and all the way up until pretty much my 21st year, it was just go out on the weekend, send it, party, drugs, and that's just the footy lifestyle as well, being in that sporting environment. So it wasn't really until I got to probably 21 when my own gut issues really started to flare up. And obviously I had all that unresolved stuff from when I was younger. And then I reached out to a mate that I used to play footy with, who actually moved up to Queensland and became a health coach. And he was really into the gut side of things. And at that time, I was finishing up my psych degree. I didn't know what I was going to do next, so I decided to go into neuroscience next. And did all my gut protocol. Found out I had a candida overgrowth. Found out I had leaky gut. A bunch of other stuff going on, and then that really inspired me to be like, nah, this is the shit that I'm really interested in. This is what I want to do. So I did a little bit of biomed after that at uni, thinking maybe I wanted to be a doctor. Went into the pharmacology subjects purely about disease, purely about medication, and obviously band-aid approaches. So that really turned me off. And then I decided to pursue the functional medicine side of things. So did some functional medicine courses, did some training at the Institute of Health, found a lot of really good mentors, got really lucky and got picked up to a private wellness club that just opened as their lead health coach, and had 2 years there with some incredible people that I got to learn from. And then, yeah, along the way, I sort of just added more and more to my bow, and I found a couple of years ago who really sort of sparked an interest in me. And I mean, we learned a decent amount of, I guess, how the brain works, how the suprachiasmatic nucleus works, so the circadian aspects and the circadian rhythm, but very, very minor in terms of uni, and definitely not to the level of the importance that Jack talks about it with. So, yeah, discovered him, went down that rabbit hole, pretty much read every single blog that he had, and just nerded out all over it. And then that's been, I guess, I'd say almost the last piece of the puzzle, because I sort of started with the nervous system, started with the psychology, then into the brain chemistry, then into gut health and nutrition and training. And yeah, now incorporating the circadian side of things. So my goal is to try and be as holistic as possible, which means that I don't want there to be anything that I can't do or I can't understand. And I feel like that's probably the big trap that most people get on their journey, is that yes, they might go and see a specialist who knows really, really, really large amounts of information about one specific topic, but they don't know how that information integrates to other areas and other systems in the body. So, yeah, hopefully that covered it and didn't carry on too much, but that's
Mhm.
pretty much brought me up to where I am now.
No, that was great. That was really interesting. I mean, it is quite interesting that you say that you started with the psychological and the stress nervous system aspect of it, and then moved on to like circadian rhythm and then diet and training. Because I feel like a lot of people in the health space, they sort of start with like training, then diet. They talk about like seed oils and they go down like the Paul Saladino route, and then you go from there to like
Mm.
the Ray Peat pipeline, and then after that it's like the circadian rhythm, the Jack Cruz sort of that sort of cult where it's all about circadian rhythm. And then at the final stage, it's like the stress and trauma aspect of it. But it's pretty cool that you sort of did it the other way around.
Yeah, and that's the thing with all of those is like you just see everyone in the, I guess, functional or the holistic space, they still fall into the same traps that people fall into in the conventional system. They find that one thing, they find circadian health, they find nutrition, whatever it is, and then they just fall in love with it. I mean, a big thing in Australia with naturopaths is mold. Like
Mm,
everything gets put down to mold, and obviously mold is a big root cause for a lot of issues, but it's that old saying, when you're a hammer, everything else is a nail. So yeah, the I find what is most important is how can you stay as unbiased as possible in your beliefs, and still know that there's obviously a hierarchy and there's a specific way that the body operates and priorities to address. But if you know that sorry, if you can hold yourself from getting too caught up in something being the answer, that's the way. Because even for me, like starting off the first few years of working with clients, I was so supplement heavy with everything that I did. Everything was like a full-on three-stage gut protocol, heal the gut lining, go into an antimicrobial phase, go into a feed and reseed phase. And that stuff works, but it's obviously not addressing those fundamental things underneath, such as what's going on with melanin, what's going on with the circadian timing, what's going on with POMC, what's going on with the vagus nerve and the signaling coming from the brain. So, yeah, we're a complex being, but that's why I love it, because it's just
mm.
so interesting and there's so much to be able to learn and delve into.
Yep. So when you work with clients, how do you sort of decide what their order of operations is in terms of like what's the root cause, what's a symptom. So if we look at, say, mold toxicity, for example, like how do we go about discovering if it's is mold the root cause or is it a symptom of your body not being able to handle it? And even stuff like circadian disruption, um, stress, trauma, like how do we figure out which one's the root cause and which one's a symptom of something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's not really an answer to it because there's never really, although we talk about finding the root cause, there's never really one root cause. There's always a combination of different things. And sometimes just the idea of trying to find the root cause can be a trap in itself because you get lost in, okay, what are the actual things that we could do right now that are going to move the needle? So, as I said at the start, I like to take it back to, okay, what is the most fundamental way we can think about this? And the goal is obviously get someone out of pain, get someone out of the symptoms that they're trying to get away from as soon as possible. And that's where like supplements can play a role. That's even where like medication can play a role as well. But it's obviously short term. It's not an answer. It's not a solution. So once you strip all that back and you think about it, okay, what is the foundation? The foundation is what's the timing mechanisms, how the timing mechanisms work in the body, and does the body feel safe? They're the two questions that the body's always asking. Am I safe and what time is it? So you need to begin to rebuild those based on regulating the nervous system, based on processing trauma, understanding what stress actually is. So that's a really important component I find is what does stress actually feel like? What do I get physiologically in the body? What happens to my breathing? What happens to my posture? What happens to my um, my mouth, my jaw, the TMJ issues that can develop? And then psychologically, what are the thought patterns that come through? What are the belief systems that take over? So once you can understand that, you can begin to sort of shift the awareness and have more control. But also then delving into the circadian side of things, like the environment is going to play a huge role. So how can you reset your system and reconfigure it to be back on schedule with what nature intended? And the tricky thing for that is we're in such an artificial made world now that it's very hard to do that because of the modern world, because of technology, because of blue light, because of stress, because of the toxins that we're exposed to, and because of the fact that we've all moved away from our mitochondrial haplotype
Mm.
base point. So that is another huge issue to try and offset. And that's what I mean. Like for some people, you're going to be able to address all of that. For other people, you're not. If I'm working with a client that's a shift worker, they're never going to be able to optimize their
Mm.
circadian rhythm while they're working shift work. So sometimes that idea of like chasing perfection and chasing the root cause can just be a big roadblock and hurdle to get through. But if you can really focus on, okay, what is actually in this person's control? What are the things that are going to really move the needle that aren't too invasive to begin with? And then from there, you really want to be able to build momentum. So once you can help someone build momentum, it's a lot easier for them to think about making a big change, which might mean they stop doing what they do for work or they go and they move to a different place in the world. But if they feel like shit and they can't sleep and they've got no energy, it's going to be really daunting to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to quit my job tomorrow and I'm going to go up to the tropics and try
Mm.
and get healthy. So yeah, it's being able to understand where the person's at, but then know, okay, these are the first things and the first dominoes to fall, so they need to be addressed first, and then from there, you just sort of connect the dots. And the perfect analogy is if it is mold, for example, even if it is a hormonal imbalance, you think of the river and you've got a power plant that's at the top of the river that's polluting the water, and you're out the front of your house, which is a kilometer down the water, and you're just cleaning the water that's in front of your house. That's
Mm.
the same idea of just treating hormones or just treating mold. Yes, it's going to clean that area, but you're going to be doing that forever. If you can go upstream and start to fix the issue where it began, then obviously you're not going to have those issues that are continuous down the line.
That's a great answer, and I think obviously stress plays a big role in this. If someone's if someone feels like they have to be perfect when it comes to optimizing their circadian rhythm and moving to the tropics, like that, the stress that would cause them, it would just be a complete net negative. And I mean, Dr. Jack Cruz talks a lot about moving to the tropics, but obviously that's not like available for everyone. And there is a lot of benefit to living in the colder climate and living in alignment with the cold climate. It's I think a lot of repeat, like people in the repeat community, they sort of try to trick their body into thinking they're living in like the tropics when they live in London, for example, and it really isn't. You really shouldn't be doing that. So like, I'd love you to speak a bit about the importance of like, yeah, living in alignment with the seasons, whether it's cold, sunny, and how that can really help us optimize our health and fix some of our problems.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, even on like cruiser stuff, when he's saying that, it's one of those things where
Mhm.
like he is right at the end of the day because he's like anyone has the ability to just fuck off and just move and leave their job and go and do whatever they want. The reality is no one's in that position to just be able to flick the switch. So yeah, I don't like that approach of just sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when there is a lot that you can do building up to that point. But then also understanding, as you said, like you can optimize depending on where you live, whether it is a low latitude, whether it is a high latitude, and being able to understand the seasonality of the way that we should be living is critical. And you're naming your podcast with like ancestral in there.
Mhm.
That's the way that we want to think about it. We want to think about it from an evolutionary perspective because although we have developed all this technology and we may act and interact completely different to how we did 1,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago, our biology is still very similar to what it was back then. And obviously, we were connected to the earth. We had our feet on the ground the whole time. We were getting information from the sun and from the magnetic pulse of the earth, the Schumann resonance that's there. So that allowed us to be fully dialed in from a circadian perspective. We also were very limited in terms of our nutritional options based on our location. You weren't able to just jump on a plane and then all of a sudden be in an environment where bananas and mangoes were growing. So that meant that you had a very specific food set that fit your haplotype and your genotype and the way that your body's designed to process food. And then also, it meant that as you go through that process, you develop a very specific microbiome that is used to specific microbes in the environment. And that is ultimately how, like, if you go and you do a gene test, it comes back and it might say you've got an ApoE type, so you're a farmer, so you're more of an agricultural genotype. But in terms of understanding, I guess, food, it is very limited to just see it as macros and see it as calories to begin with, because it is information. And we think about carbohydrates, well, they're light information, they're full of biophotons. So understanding the seasonality of those and the consequences that happen when you go against that, such as eating a banana in the middle of winter in the 37th latitude where I am, which means it's going to be a lot of stress on your system because it's going to be a lot of deuterium clogging up the mitochondrial matrix, which the body isn't able to offset because there is a lack of sunlight and there is a lack of magnetic charge that's coming as well. So being able to understand that is really key in the decisions that you make. But then depending on where you are, as you said, you can use the cold to your advantage. There is a way that we are able to generate heat and generate energy in the body for those of us who have an uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype. And that was our way of dealing with less UV light. So by optimizing that pathway, we're actually able to generate light that is stronger than the sun, UVC light, which is able to create this incredible process within the body. And cold also has magnetic effects in terms of the electron transport chain and the way the mitochondria function to reduce a lot of the reactive oxygen species that are there. And if you think about the way that most mammals exist in nature, what do they do during winter? They hibernate and they go away and they actually recharge. And we are designed to do the same thing. We're designed to have more autophagy because we're producing more melatonin because the darkness window is longer during winter than it is during summer. So being able to work with that is key. But as we know, the modern world, if you work a 9 to 5, you work a 9 to 5 for 365 days of the year. It's not working in with the seasons. So that means some mornings you wake up and it's still pitch black when you get to work. And you've missed that window of sunlight in the morning. Whereas in summer, and there's daylight savings, for example, you've got a much greater window of sun exposure to be able to maximize. So that's one of the big reasons why winter is such an, I guess, an issue for people to be able to adjust to. But then, as I said before, the blue light side of things and the non-native EMF side of things as well just throw another spanner into the works because it's creating more stress on the system in a time when we should be optimizing repair and recovery.
No, that's such a good answer. I mean, when it comes to circadian rhythms, I think most people sort of understand like the benefit of the sun and the dangers of artificial blue light. But I mean, a lot of people don't talk about like the seasonal aspect of it, like um, the fact that yeah, like you said, if you're living in a northern climate, you shouldn't really be having a tropical fruit from say Costa Rica. So I think yeah, it's great that you've spoke about that. And then on the topic of cold specifically, I'd love for you to expand a bit about what you said about mitochondrial haplotypes and how they affect our metabolism and how cold and hot temperatures can affect how our mitochondrial haplotype runs.
Yeah. So pretty much what happens is those of us that evolved away from the equator, where we were leaving that really warm, high UV climate, we were going into those colder environments. We had to make up for a lack of sunlight, not just from an energy perspective, but also how we're going to maintain body temperature. Now, we had the ability to uncouple our mitochondria, which meant that we actually generated more, I guess, the way of thinking about it is like we almost poked more holes in the flow of our mitochondria, which created more heat, more thermal energy that we were then able to generate back into the system. So, in doing so, that allows us to be able to turn on all of these really powerful programs. Like, for example, there's a protein, a heat shock protein that we generate, which is also an equivalent in cold shock proteins, which is why ice baths are so awesome in the right situations. And being in that environment, it is a free radical scavenger and it is completely charging the autophagy process. So when you go into those environments and you are an uncoupled haplotype, you should let your body adjust. Your body has the ability to adjust to that temperature. Whereas if you're a coupled haplotype and you're in those environments, you actually struggle to make that adjustment because your mitochondria can't uncouple, they can't generate heat the same way. And when you begin to work through that, you can see for those that are from equatorial regions, whether that be through Asia, whether that be through Africa, whether that be through like Central America, for example, when they go into climates that are further away from the equator, like where you are, like where I am, like Northern America, then they really struggle because they're not getting the UV light that they need to obviously power and charge their melanin in their system, but they also can't actually create that thermal heat, and their brown adipose tissue doesn't generate the same way that it would for someone who is used to being further away from the equator. So there are little nuances there. Again, it's not black and white. It doesn't necessarily mean that people can't optimize in that environment, but it just means you sort of have that weakness or strength in some situations that you need to be aware of to optimize.
Yeah, I mean, I'm East Asian, but living in the UK, it's like I pretty much spend the whole summer sunbathing, like building up my solar callus, allowing myself to make that melanin and get a tan so that I'm able to actually harness sun exposure better. But also during the cold seasons, I'm very intentional about like not having the heater on, like letting my body adjust to that cold temperature so that it's able to, like you said, uncouple the flow of electrons from ATP and to make heat instead. So I think that's really important. I did have a question. So what would you say someone's like living in the UK during summer, and they decide during winter to move to Costa Rica or somewhere tropical where it's hot and sunny all year round? Do you think there's any harm to that? Because to me, it sort of seems like even though it's obviously good to live in the tropics and get a lot of sun exposure all year round, it does sort of seem like a bit of a hack, like something we shouldn't be doing to like bypass the cold winters and stuff. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that just depends on your like mitochondrial haplotype or each person's individual health situation?
Yeah, I do think it has to do with each person's specific situation. For example, if you are someone who does have chronic disease or an immune condition or something that you're trying to heal from, that's definitely the way to go is to try and get yourself to the tropics because you're going to be in a higher UV yield, you're going to be in a higher magnetic zone. So essentially, you're going to be able to charge all the healing powers that you have in your system. But as you said, again, that's not very tied to nature is it if we go and do that.
Mm.
The counter side to it is the fact that we can do that because even if you have an uncoupled haplotype, you can recouple it based on going back to like a low latitude region. So, for example, you, as someone who's uncoupled, you have the ability to go back to that coupled haplotype. And I believe, can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's about 18 to 24 months that it takes for that process to occur. So that would allow you to go back there and to thrive. But obviously, the seasonality is going to be a big factor. And if you are someone who is uncoupled, you need to think you have that window in winter where you go through deeper stages of autophagy and deeper levels of melatonin into your system. So without getting that, you're compromising.
Mm.
And unless you're really dialed in from all those other elements, you need that period during winter to be able to allow for your cells to go through that process of regeneration.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we see health issues from people living in the tropics who they aren't getting enough cold during winter, or because we see lots of health issues from people who like live in a really northern cold climate all year round, and they're not maximizing their sun exposure. They're sort of just treating every season like it's the same. They'll have the heating on during winter. They'll have sunbeds. They'll take vitamin D pills. And then during summer they'll put like sunglasses on, sunscreen, air conditioning. We know that's bad for us because it's you're not letting your body actually know what like know what its environment is. But I wonder if we see issues the other way around, where it's people who live in the tropics all year round and they're not able to get cold and reap the benefits of that. So, yeah, do you think there's issues with that? Like, do you see people struggle with living in a hot climate all year round?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had any clients that have been in that situation. I've had them in the first example that you shared. But I do think, yeah, there's obviously so for example, my fiance, she's from or her haplotype is from Papua New Guinea, which is fourth or fifth south latitude, and she lives here in Melbourne. So she's always going to struggle during winter in the cold. She's always feeling better when she gets into the sun. She's always going to take longer to be able to really build up her vitamin D stores and her melanin as well. So there is that higher requirement. But I do believe the more, I guess, dialed in everything is from a stress perspective, nutrition wise, training, nervous system, then those changes would be pretty minimal in my opinion. But I do think from like what we were talking about earlier, from a dietary perspective, that's probably where you're looking at more issues arise. Just because, again, if you're eating carbohydrates 12 months of the year, that's obviously going to be a big issue.
Mm, yeah, 100%. I mean, I feel like a lot of animal-based influencers, like they never really touch on the seasonal side of it. Like Paul Saladino, he doesn't tell people that the reason that he's thriving off of fruit and honey is because he lives in Costa Rica. So like
Mm.
someone from Iceland might be watching his videos and thinking, oh well, I might have to start importing fruits from the tropics if I want to be healthy. And it's like, no, because your environment's different and the way that you benefit from that is different. But on the topic of circadian health and living in alignment with the summer, so what are the problems with people who they're scared of the sun. They'll put sunscreen on. They'll wear sunglasses. Why is that not a good thing, especially during summer?
Yeah, so I mean, the main issue is what's going on with melanin and and also just POMC activation in general. So the majority of people are already deficient in melanin. The majority of people already have minimal POMC activation going on, which is pro-opioid melanocortin. And that cleaves into specific peptides that have very specific functions within the body. So one of them is going to be into alpha MSH, which has a really important role in synthesizing the melanin that is there. But then also thinking about like the beta endorphins role, which has huge implications from a mental health perspective. And then even just the ability to generate that DC electric current, which is the whole power of the sun providing us energy, is that we can harness that energy into a DC electric current throughout the body, which is what Dr. Robert Becker talks about in the body electric, for example. So without that and without that activation, there's a huge chunk of I guess, benefit that people are missing out on. And usually, when you're adding in on top of that, the fact that they are wearing sunscreen and they are wearing sunglasses, which hugely damages the function of the retina and that whole retinal hypothalamic tract, which is constantly sending input signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to tell it what time of day it is. Then there's a huge mismatch from a circadian perspective. We also have our photoreceptors within the skin that allow us to pick up those signals alongside the retina. And if they're getting disrupted signaling, then there's just a huge cascade that goes on from there. But the main issue and the reason why people get sunburn in the first place is the fact that they're not priming their skin the way that it's designed to. So in the morning, when we get that early infrared light that becomes available, what happens is that we prime the skin to create urocanic acid, and then we also create so what I'm looking for, urocanic acid and filigrim. And they provide us with a natural protective barrier and mechanism within our skin. So that prevents us from getting extreme levels of sunburn because the skin is building up throughout the day. Because again, if you're waking up and living in accordance with nature, you're getting that early morning sun, you're getting that infrared, which also has incredible benefits for creating that structured water throughout the system, which is going to charge the fascia. It's going to feed into the mitochondria. And then as the UVA comes in and we get the activation of those specific compounds, then the skin is primed for the UVB that's going to come later to be able to tolerate it and absorb it effectively. And we want to absorb it effectively so that we do get the process of melanin synthesis occur, because it's not just melanin that creates the pigment in our skin, it's also the fact that melanin has a really important role within the entire nervous system, and that is the neuromelanin that we develop. And there's a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is literally black because it has so melanin dense. And that's also tied to dopamine and noradrenaline as well. So knowing that it plays that function, it's not just how we're looking on the outside, it's okay, what's happening on the inside if we're losing that amount of melanin. And there's a lot of it built up in specific areas of the body, such as the sphincters, whether that be the lower esophageal one, which uses a lot of energy and can be tied to issues with low stomach acid, with GERD. But then also the fact that it is protective for us against radiation. So the melanin protects us from DNA damage. It also protects us from any damage within the radioactive spectrum, such as the damage from non-native EMF. And that is one of the reasons why when you go on a plane and you fly and you're in a box that's full of non-native EMF, you lose your tan because the body and melanin is using itself to protect. It's also got the ability to split water and has a really important role in bringing deuterium out of the mitochondrial matrix. I mean, the list goes on in terms of the functions of melanin. It's so important, but without having optimal sun exposure, without the sunglasses, without the sunscreen, you're not going to be able to synthesize that effectively. So yeah, all those amazing functions that it has around semiconduction, around creating that DC current and helping the mitochondria are just non-existent. So you can really go back and just say, hey, look, there's so many there's so many issues right now in the world where the root cause is a lack of POMC in the skin. And depending on where you come from, so for example, if you're a Fitzpatrick 1, which is fair skin, or you're a Fitzpatrick, I believe it's 6 it goes up to, when you're darker skin, you've got a higher requirement of UV light to be able to hit your POMC and melanin activation threshold. So if you live in a high latitude region like we do, and you're a Fitzpatrick 5 or a Fitzpatrick 6, you're going to probably need like 5 to 6 hours of full spectrum light to be able to synthesize the same amount of melanin, same amount of POMC as someone who's from fairer skin, who only would probably need 1 hour. So that's an important distinction there. And it is, again, coming back to what we spoke about, is it actually possible to fully optimize if you're out of accordance with your natural and your genetic makeup? Probably not from that scenario and that way of thinking. But then knowing that, if POMC is not there, if it's not being activated the way that we need it to, then it is going to lead to gut issues. It is going to lead to immune issues. It is going to lead to even sticking the nervous system into more of a sympathetic state, which is also going to have more downstream effects. It's going to create I guess, a more low dopamine state within the system. And one of the key amino acids we need to create dopamine is tyrosine, which is also involved in melanin synthesis as well. And it's also going to be a big one in terms of inflammation as well. So if the body's stuck in inflammation, whether there's dysbiosis, whether there's toxins, whether there's immune proteins being circulated, then that's also going to impact the body's ability to generate and synthesize melanin. And the final piece of the puzzle, I'll wrap it up with, is what's happening at night with melatonin. If we're not getting sufficient exposure throughout the day of UV light, we're not going to generate enough melatonin to get successful autophagy when we sleep. And also, as we expose ourselves to artificial light, which we know is a huge issue with blue light, computers, phones, especially once the sun goes down, then we're impacting and delaying that release of melatonin. So if we only have a little bit to release anyway, because we're getting such limited sun exposure, and then we're delaying that release further because we're watching TV up until we go to bed, then you may only have like a 1 hour window of going into NREM 3 and 4 where the body is going through autophagy. And that is also going to be involved in cell turnover, particularly in the skin. So if there is any potentially cancerous cells that are there, that is the body's detective mechanism, autophagy, to be able to go in there and deal with it and clean it up. So that's another reason why if someone does get sunburnt and then they're not getting optimal melatonin release at night, that's how, sorry, it becomes an issue over time. But the simplicity of it is as well, you can look at these longitudinal studies and a lot of the ones that Cruz shares and talks about. The more sun exposure you have across your lifetime, the longer you will live. It's as simple as that. That was the study that was done over the course of, I think, 20 years or 30 years in Sweden. And it was strongly correlated, that pathway. And it's the light in isolation that everyone on the conventional side of things wants to use as their evidence to say that the sun causes skin cancer. But as we know, nature is a decentralized machine. It is never using anything in isolation. It is constantly connected. It is constantly using these different pathways to balance things out and create homeostasis, which is why infrared light, which is why those proteins that I mentioned earlier that we produce in the morning are all there to stop us from getting to the stage of allowing UV light to be damaging to us. And the last thing I'll say is there's just a lack of common sense.
Mm.
You see animals, what they do when it's hot, they go and seek shade. They don't lay in the sun for the entirety of the day. Whereas we think we're smarter than that because we've got this big prefrontal cortex that we've developed and we think we can outthink nature, which means that we go out there, we roast ourselves, we go to the tropics for a few weeks, not wear sunscreen when we haven't had that constant like build up throughout the year and we haven't developed a solar callus. And then we get burnt and then we go, what the hell? And then we get skin cancer in 30 years, which isn't the fault of the sun. It's the fault of the lack of respect for the sun that's led to it.
That was me. Yeah, that was really good. I think once you start to understand melanin and how important it is, not just because people talk about how it protects against excess UV damage, which it does, but it goes, like you said, it's so much more than that. Like the way it affects our neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, um, the way it affects our mood, like it chelates heavy metals as well. Like it does so much for us.
Mm.
Um, but I'd like to talk a bit about gut health and how people call gut health like gut, the second brain, like the gut brain axis. So I'd love for you to talk about why that is and what are some common gut issues that people face, and like does this sort of come back to like a circadian disruption, stress, what could be causing people's gut issues?
Yeah, awesome. So there's this great diagram that I love to show my clients whenever we talk about gut health, and it says that poor choices lead to an inflamed gut, which leads to an inflamed brain, which leads to a low mood, which then leads to poor choices.
Mm.
And that is the case for a lot of people and what they're stuck in. So, I mean, the gut's got so it's not just the gut to brain axis that exists. There's so many different axes that the gut has. So there's a gut to skin, gut to reproductive, gut to endocrine, gut to immune, gut to liver, gut to pancreas. The list goes on. So the gut is connected to all these different areas within the body, and knowing that is critical because it is very early on in terms of the hierarchy alongside. So you'd think nervous system, circadian health, and then gut's pretty much next on the list that you'd want to be considering. It also homes a huge percentage of the immune system. So if there are any immune issues, they're usually going to be stemming from issues within the gut. And you got to think the gut has a more protective barrier than any other system in the body. The whole intestinal tract, when you think about it, it's not even in the body. It's actually outside of the body because it has those protective barriers around it. So that's how, when there is gut issues, it can be so damaging because the body's not designed to have those issues. I mean, there is exercise-induced permeability, there is heat-induced permeability, which are natural things that we go through that makes the gut leaky or makes the gut permeable. But they would only happen over specific times and in specific situations evolutionarily. So the main issue that people face is intestinal permeability, leaky gut. Um, and there's different types. There's paracellular, there's transcellular. There's also, I guess, some more severe stages of it as well, where you can get literal damage to the epithelial cells of the gut. But a nice simple way of thinking about it is in order to maintain that integrity, there's got to be optimal functioning of those tight junction proteins, which are the gatekeepers that make sure that the gut stays nice and closed when it needs to. And then there's the lining of the gut, which is connected to our good bacteria. Our beneficial bacteria play a really important role in regulating permeability. And as we know, they're very depleted in the modern world due to antibiotics, due to pesticides, herbicides, due to tap water, pharmaceuticals, the list goes on. And then there's the actual structured water that the body creates that plays a role in maintaining the balance within the gut lining. So if any of that breaks down, then what happens is things such as toxins, proteins, bad bacteria, LPS, lipopolysaccharides that negative gram bacteria produce, they can slip through the gut lining, go into the blood, and then once they're in the blood, it's pretty much a
Mhm.
free-for-all. They can go wherever they want. They're in the hepatic portal system. Now, what else can happen is they can then go upstream and they can penetrate through the blood-brain barrier. And now non-native EMFs open up those calcium gates and create more permeability within the brain. So this is why now more than ever there are so many issues with neural inflammation and neurotoxicity because that blood-brain barrier is becoming more and more permeable based on the environment that we've created. So once we get inflammation in the brain, we know that's going to impact different neurotransmitter signaling, whether that be GABA, whether that be serotonin, glutamate, dopamine. And for most people, they already have an imbalance of GABA and glutamate to begin with. So that's where the big issues arise because the nervous system is constantly in a sympathetic state. It's constantly being excited. And when that happens, it can only happen for so long because over time, as cortisol is chronically elevated, we then begin to have these rise in inflammatory proteins and inflammatory molecules. That can go on for a certain amount of time. Like we are very resilient. Men are obviously more resilient to this than females are, purely by our nature of not needing to create life. But over time, we get that depletion, and then that's where we begin to see things like adrenal fatigue show up, which impact neurotransmitter functioning even more, impacts nerve and neuronal signaling. And then that's obviously a huge issue because that's going to impact your mood, that's going to impact your motivation, which is really going to put you into a rut, and can keep you stuck there. So when you understand how that can play out, it's obviously really important to think, okay, what can we do to protect the gut? How can we protect the gut lining? How can we build the microbiome and create a healthy, balanced microbiome rather than most of the overgrowths that are there? So yeah, leaky gut is a really common one. Low stomach acid is also another common one, which gets mimicked or gets, I guess, hidden behind the symptoms of high stomach acid, which means that the treatment is, let's use protein pump inhibitors, which then lower stomach acid and make the issue worse because there's a certain threshold of stomach acid that needs to hit the lower esophageal sphincter in order to maintain that level, and keep it closed. So if there's already low melanin and then there's already low stomach acid going on, then what can happen is we can get that reflux come upstream and then bang, we get heartburn, we get a little bit of GERD, and we think we have low stomach acid, which then depletes us of key nutrients that only stomach acid can break down, such as zinc, such as magnesium, even such as like vitamin B12, sorry, when you look at blood work and you see them low, you can usually, based on obviously ticking off intake of those nutrients, you can usually tie it down to an absorption issue. So that's another really common one. And then that will lead to other issues such as SIBO, such as parasites such as Candida, because that digestive tract should be a very specific pH. And if that pH is out of balance, then what happens is we create an environment where these more pathogenic microbes can thrive. So SIBO is very common, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and just dysbiosis in general. A lot of people have really low levels of beneficial flora. If you have had a history such as I have, where you've had a lot of antibiotics, where you've been on something like Roaccutane, then that can really deplete those levels, and then that can lead to those other issues that develop because of the um, beneficial roles that all of those good bacteria play in regulating the microbiome, but also even from a nutrient absorption perspective. So that's another really important aspect of gut health to think about. And then the last one that I'd say would be like vagus nerve dysfunction or poor vagal tone. So the vagus nerve is that 10th cranial nerve that connects the brain and the gut via the enteric nervous system. And if that is dysfunctional, based on, I mean, there's a lot of things that can impact it. There can be that chronic sympathetic state that we're in. There can be inflammation. There can be postural issues. There can be lymphatic issues as well. There can be a lack of like acetylcholine, for example, which is a really key neurotransmitter that's required for its signaling. Then the gut is never going to get optimal signaling from the brain. And that's also going to be connected to the circadian side of things because there are those circadian clocks within the gut that are really important in terms of optimizing digestion. So, for example, in the morning, we have our highest digestive capacity, our bile and our stomach acid are at the highest level that they will be for the day. But the migrating motor complex is also operating at its best at that time. So we are designed to have quite a big meal early in the
Mm.
day. And then as the day goes on, our digestive capacity begins to sort of reduce until eventually it gets to sundown when it turns off because we're going into rest and repair mode. Now, a lot of people aren't even starting their dinner until it gets dark outside. So then what happens is they start to eat, and that only leaves them with a very small window, meaning that they're not going to get optimal leptin signaling, they're not going to get optimal melatonin release, and their sleep is going to be compromised, and the ability to regenerate the microbiome and also the lining and the mucosal lining is going to be compromised as well. So it is pretty, I guess, multifaceted, the gut, based on all those different aspects. But at the same time, there are a lot of foundational things that everyone should be doing for their gut that is going to really move the needle a lot to optimize it.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard Dr. Alexis Cowan. It was on your podcast actually. It's actually how I discovered her, but she was talking about how there's a seasonal aspect to leaky gut where it's I think she said something about how gut permeability isn't necessarily a bad thing during winter. Um, so I'd love for you to elaborate on that and nuance behind gut,
Yeah.
leaky gut and gut permeability.
Yeah. So I guess her idea of it was allowing for more nutrient absorption during winter. So as we would get less sun, we'd obviously have lower levels of vitamin D, and vitamin D plays a really important role in tight junction function as well. And usually, a lot of people that are low in vitamin D will have permeability because of
Mm,
that and because of its immune functioning roles as well. But also, if you think about like it does take quite a lot of energy in order to maintain the integrity of the lining. So as that happens, and we do have a disruption, whether it be changes in food, whether it be heightened periods of fasting as well, which would also happen during that time, then we can have a bit of an immune shift that goes on. So that would probably shift from like TH1 towards TH17 dominance, which is going to then impact secretory IgA function, which is also another really important component. So when you get a gut test, that's a really important one to look at to see how well the gut lining is functioning. And then also like those different microbes, well, you think about it, if we're going into that period when we're not having, I guess, more carbohydrates, we're having less fiber as well because there's less growing around us, then we're going to be starving off the microbiome a little bit more, which is going to be a good thing because it will like kill off a lot of the
mm,
pathogens or starve out a lot of the pathogens, but it will also starve out a lot of the beneficial microbes, which, as I mentioned before, have a really important role in allowing the gut to remain nice and tight and nice and closed. So, yeah, I'm not too sure where I sit on thinking whether or not it would be an advantage at that time. But there is definitely like those things that I mentioned, which would mean that it would be more likely that it would happen. And again,
Mm.
if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, then that's probably there for a reason during that time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it does make sense to me that there would be a seasonal aspect to gut health and leaky gut and gut permeability. Um, but you've touched on how stress sort of affects gut health. So is that just through, like we spoke about cortisol, but and then there's the whole GABA glutamate balance. But what other pathways can stress negatively affect our gut health?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to think about is and it's really simple. It's really simple for people to understand as well. What are the two states the nervous system can be in? It can be in parasympathetic or it can be in sympathetic. When we're stressed, which one are we in? We're in sympathetic. What happens in order for the digestive system to function optimally? It needs parasympathetic signaling via the vagus nerve. So that is going to allow for stomach acid to be produced. That is going to allow for salivary enzymes, pancreatic enzymes to be released. And then even from like a intestinal churning perspective, it's going to allow for optimal peristalsis, meaning that stool is going to move optimally throughout the gut. So if we are in that zone, then yeah, we're not going to have that. And most people, they don't eat in that zone. They are watching TV, they are around blue light, which is going to increase blood glucose. It's going to increase those more excitatory neurotransmitters, and they're usually distracted. And then their eating habits are poor. They're scoffing their food down. They're not optimizing their biomechanical digestion. They're usually sitting slouched as well, so that they're not getting optimal blood flow and lymphatic flow. And that's another component as well. So obviously with stress, and we are getting more of those inflammatory cytokines being released, then the lymphatic system is going to become more stagnant. The lymphatic system is critical in terms of optimal gut function and gut signaling. So if we're not getting optimal lymphatic flow, then we're going to have more dysbiosis that's going to be present because it's going to be harder for us to remove those toxins. And then with more dysbiosis in the system, it feeds back into those ideas of stress. So it really comes down to the first thing that I mentioned around having an inflamed gut in the first place is going to lead to an inflamed brain, and then it's going to lead to more of those negative choices around food, negative choices around habits, which is then going to feed back into it. So yeah, it's really important to understand that pathway. Obviously, as you said, cortisol is really important
Mm.
because it will thin the gut lining during that time. It will suppress secretory IgA function around the lining, and it's also going to impact stomach acid production. And like I said before, stomach acid is so important, and usually is one of the first things that gets out of balance that then leads to those other issues to develop. But it's really important. And then I guess like histamine is going to play a role. Other food intolerances and the way that they'll be impacting and modulating the immune system will also play a role. And the real like interesting mechanism, and I can't remember if I think it was called like the CEO pathway or something like that. But pretty much what it is like if you have a negative gram bacteria overgrowth,
Mm.
and the fact that like those negative gram bacteria, they have that double cell wall and they have like a really robust biofilm as well. And in that biofilm is LPS, lipopolysaccharides. Under periods of stress, those cell walls break down, that outer cell membrane, and that releases more LPS into the system. That LPS then leads back upstream, creates more stress, creates more cortisol dominance, which then feeds back into those negative gram bacteria, and thus they release more LPS. So it can be a real, like, evil, I guess, cycle that can begin that people can get stuck in. And it's literally how, like, you know, those types of people that they feed on stress from the energetic and the emotional aspect.
Mm.
People do feed on stress, and it leads back into that loop. And as I said, we're quite resilient. We can get through a lot as a human, but eventually it hits that breaking point, and then all of a sudden we were fine 6 months ago, and now we've got three or four different chronic health conditions that are showing up. So yeah, so LPS is a big one, vagus nerve signaling, stomach acid, the immune modulation that's happening in the gut, and then obviously the choices that we make around our food and around our lifestyle is going to play a role with stress.
Yeah. Could you expand a bit on the vagus nerve? Because I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I'm not too familiar with it. So could you explain to our listeners, like, what does it do? Why is it important? And how does, like you said, stress affect it negatively?
Yeah, so it's the 10th cranial nerve, so it connects the brain to the gut, and the system that it works on is a branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, the enteric nervous system. And it's really, really critical in terms of sending those messages from the body to the brain. So there's still, I think it's roughly 80/20, which is funny because that's the term that I
Mhm.
think about they need to be focusing on. 80% of those messages are coming from the body to the brain. 20% are coming from the brain to the body. So afferent and efferent pathways. So there's a lot of communication happening regardless, but in order for those processes that I mentioned before around the digestive system with stomach acid production, pancreatic enzymes, bile, motility, immune modulations for the microbiome, the peristalsis, all of those happen via signaling that's going on in the vagus nerve. It's also a cholinergic pathway, so it does require optimal levels of choline in the system, and in particular acetylcholine. And it will also tell the body how it should navigate specific types of inflammation, whether that be reducing TNF alpha, interleukin 6. They're a lot of the key cytokines that can be present around here. And the big issue for people is that they have poor vagal tone. So it can be compression of the vagus nerve. It can be a physical thing where they have forward head posture and they're not getting optimal signaling going on. It can be a lymphatic issue as well. The lymphatic system can be congested around that point, meaning that the nerve can get stuck and entrapped in its signaling. And then there's, as I mentioned, from a neurotransmitter perspective, the molecules there are going to be really important as well.
Mm.
So that's, I guess, the biological side of things. There's also a huge energetic component that is the main piece of the throat chakra puzzle, which is tied to like speaking truth and being able to, I guess, lean into who you are, which is really important. And there is big correlations around poor vagal tone and people who do struggle to speak, whether that be in public, whether that be to specific people that they have conflict with. So it's really interesting understanding, I guess, those metaphysical aspects of it as well. But in terms of, yeah, knowing how to optimize it, really it comes down to how you can create that parasympathetic state in your system, and then be able to give it the right signals. And I mean, singing, humming, they're great ways to optimize it. Cold exposure is amazing. What else? Doing the lymphatic work, Dr. Perry Nicholson's Big Six, that's an awesome way of optimizing as well. And then deep diaphragmatic breath work is great because breath work and breathing in general, like breathing is our gateway to control our nervous system.
Mhm.
When we're stressed, it's very hard to try and turn off stressful thoughts with thinking. You can't outthink your way because the mind is always going to win. It knows how to play its little tricks on you. But if you can get past that and utilize your own physiology via optimizing the vagus nerve and using deep diaphragmatic breathing, using like box breath technique, which is 4 second inhale, 4 second hold, 4 second exhale, 4 second hold, or even like a 4-7-8 technique. I mean, there's so many different breathwork techniques that are amazing, both down regulating the system and up regulating the system. But if you can understand that the more of those signals you can give the body, the more it will prioritize parasympathetic signaling, the better the vagus nerve is going to be able to communicate with the gut and vice versa.
Mm. Um, so what are some, when it comes to the lymphatic system, does that just come down to like lymphatic drainage, lymphatic massages? What other techniques are there to, because I've seen people like they'll put their legs up on the wall at night to promote
Yeah.
lymphatic release. Like, what other ways are there to improve that lymphatic system so we're able to remove toxins and stress from our system?
Yeah, so yeah, there's definitely those ones. The way you want to think about it is that the system does require movement. It does require optimal fluid flow. And the reason why, if anyone's looked at Dr. Perry Nicholson's The Big Six, which is the six main lymphatic points of the body, it has to be done in a specific order because that system of ours is like it's built into a specific type of pressure, meaning that everything in the body, everything in the lymphatic system has to flow through the collarbone, for example. That is
Mm.
point one. Point two is behind the jaw where it connects to the top of the neck. Point three is the armpit, which there's a crossover system. So the left armpit, I believe, drains the kidneys, and then the right armpit is the liver. We've then got the gut, and if you look at a lymphatic map of the body, there are like a huge percentage of those lymph nodes, those big ones around the gut, which is why it is so important to optimize that for gut health. The hip crease is another point where we have these big collection, and then behind the knees. Now, that system is building up throughout the day. So, any inflammation that you have is working through the lymphatic system.
Mm.
Any bloating, any swelling, that's all through the lymphatic system. So what happens is we have movement and contraction of muscle that helps to move that fluid, in particular the calves. The calves are the second heart in a way, but they also help to pump the lymphatic system. We also have the diaphragm, which if you've ever seen a ultrasound of someone taking a deep diaphragmatic breath, it is pushing down on all the other internal organs and almost giving them that massage and allowing for that fluid movement to occur. So, optimal breathing mechanics are really important. And for most people, they have a dysfunctional or an altered breathing style as it is. Usually, when you say to someone, take a big deep breath, they breathe up into their chest and they usually suck their belly in when the reality is we should be breathing into our diaphragm with the two-thirds of the breath. And as we breathe in, we should get an expansion, not just an expansion in front, but an expansion 360 degrees to the front, to the sides, and to the back. That is how you really optimize the diaphragm. So a lot of people have a weak diaphragm, meaning that they don't get that optimal pump through the lymphatic system, which can create a lot of stagnation. A lot of people are mouth breathers as well, which is more sympathetic on the system. For example, me yapping as much as I am right now, I'm creating a lot of
Mm.
sympathetic effects in my body because I'm not breathing and oxygenating effectively. So that is going to play a role. And then, yeah, getting consistent movement throughout the day. So I always suggest to clients they start off with the big six in the morning because overnight we are working that lymphatic system, we're detoxifying. There's a part of the brain that has its own called the lymphatic system, and that is working to accumulate all that waste and all those toxins. And in the morning, we need to manually release some of these points because they get stagnant. And you see people use a rebounder, you see people do dry brushing, they're amazing, but they're only going to work if those main points are released. So that's why that has to be a non-negotiable for people to do first thing in the morning. And then after that, doing some rotational twists, doing some qigong movements, doing some shaking, doing skipping, anything that's going to get that rhythmic contraction is going to have really great vibrational effects that are going to help fluid movement throughout the body. And then also creating that structured water. If you're not getting enough infrared light and you're not creating enough structured water intracellularly, then it's going to be very hard for that fluid to excrete those toxins and it is going to become more stagnant. So you want to think about consistency over intensity as a motto for pretty much everything, especially when it comes to breathing and it comes to movement for the lymphatic system. But yeah, those techniques are great. The big six, the rebounder, vibration balls and vibration guns can be great as well. I wouldn't use them all the time, but in very like acute settings, they're really good if you're doing an extended session. And then making sure you're obviously sweating, getting to a sauna, exercising. That's a great way to help aid the system. And then making sure, yeah, your breathing mechanics are dialed in. Doing a little bit of intentional diaphragmatic breath work can help as well. Um, and yeah, I mean, you could probably add a few supplements in there, such as like serapeptidase, which is great because it can help break down some proteolytic enzymes. It has proteolytic enzymes in it, sorry, so it can break down some waste structures, help aid fluid transport. I also like to use a binder, something like bentonite clay or charcoal or chlorella can be really good. And then even just how you can optimize blood flow. So something like ginkgo biloba, using something like nattokinase can be really good. Beetroot, pomegranate juice, all those different ideas to try and get optimal blood flow and fluid movement. They're really going to be great to help optimize that system.
And how does the lymphatic system and all of this tie into fascia? Because fascia is another one of these like term concepts that I've not spoken about too much because I haven't fully gone down the rabbit hole of it. But I'd love for you to explain like what's fascia, how does it sort of tie into like the lymphatic system, stress, emotions? Um, so yeah,
Yeah. So I mean, fascia is incredible. And do you follow MT
I do.
Performance? I think his
Yeah,
name is
is he
yeah,
the
he's
Norwegian
awesome.
guy? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's awesome in this space because he does a lot of bodywork stuff, and yeah, it's really good to be able to see it in action, the concepts. But essentially, like fascia is it's not just the connective tissue. It's literally this network that intertwines everything. It intertwines all the skin, it intertwines all the muscle fibers as well, and it's this almost liquid crystalline network that we have, which is where water plays a really important role. So structured water that we create, easy water, which is interstitial fluid, that is really important in terms of optimizing fascia. And then collagen is also really important. So those collagen fibers are what we generate. And the way that it works is it's almost like there's a really cool guy to check out called Thomas Myers, I believe, who talks about this. It's almost like this weight distribution network that allows for complete balance in the body. So for most people that have imbalances in their body, it's not actually muscle imbalances, it's tightness or restriction in their fascia. And the fascia can get stuck and it can get dehydrated. And that is usually where you're going to get knots and sores around the body. It can be where you can get like those reoccurring muscle issues. And a good way to think about it is if you can use like infrared light, if you can use structured water, for example, then you can hydrate that through something like manual release. So that's where getting a trigger ball, that's where getting a foam roller is amazing, because it allows for that constant movement of fluid throughout the system. So again, if the lymphatic system is stagnant, that is our primary fluid network, along with our cardiovascular system for our blood. It's going to leak into what's happening with the fascia. So they'll generally go hand in hand. So if we don't have optimal zeta potential in the blood, which we generate from creating polarity, which happens from building our net negative charge by getting electrons, by being in the sun, by getting our feet on the earth, then that also is going to create stagnation in the blood flow. So they're the main concepts you want to think about of how things could go wrong. And then another aspect is the emotional aspect. Now, the emotional aspect, I believe, is connected to the fact that water does have the ability to hold memory. And this is getting, I guess, a little bit woo-woo with these ideas, but there's an amazing lady named Veda Austin who's written a really cool book talking about water and how water has the ability to hold memory and has its own form of consciousness within it. So I believe when there's stagnation in specific parts of the fascial network, it is tied to an emotional wound or an emotional
Mm.
scar that is there. And it's really powerful when you do myofascial release. And like there's those guys, the Human Garage, that show it in action when you do some fascial release that people get really emotional and they can have these big trauma releases because that is where we are storing that repressed or that suppressed energy that is there. So yeah, it's pretty cool being able to understand how those systems interact with each other. So yeah, the lymph is mainly that waste and immune signaling pathway. Then the fascia is the structural container that is sort of tying and linking everything together that allows that structured water to flow on. And then yeah, the emotions are, I guess, those different patterns and those different frequencies that exist that do correlate to the different chakras, which are the different energy centers in the body, which is why a lot of people that they tied to like guilt, shame, fear, those types of emotions which correlate with root chakra issues, they tend to have tight hips, they tend to have tight psoas muscles, they then tend to get like reproductive issues or they get IBD or IBS. It's not necessarily an imbalance based on physiology, it's an imbalance from the energetic and the emotional side of things that is connecting back to the fascia and the way that structured water is moving around the body.
That's so interesting. Because I think a lot of people they might have their diet and their training regime completely optimized, and even their circadian rhythm. But when it comes to emotions, stress, trauma, um, they might be struggling there. And how does that sort of like, what would be some symptoms of them, of their emotions and their stress? Like what are some symptoms of that? Like, say you've got everything optimized, but you're
Mm.
struggling with like negative emotions, negative thoughts. Like, how does that like? What are some symptoms of that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting one, and it's always one that I spend a lot of time talking to mentees about is distinguishing what actually is physical in the body. What is a
Mm.
physical sensation? What is a physical symptom? And then what is an energetic symptom or an energetic sensation that's in the body and an emotional one? And there is a lot of blur between that. And there are obviously people who, for example, they're in stage four cancer and they get told they've got 6 months to live. They quit their job, they go and move to the tropics, they leave their relationship, they completely change their life. And all of a sudden, bang, they've just had their cancer completely gone and it never comes back. And that just goes to show, hey, maybe it's not always biochemical or toxin related. Maybe it does have an energy component that is stored there. So that's something that takes a lot of introspection and a lot of work on yourself to be able to understand these concepts because they are they aren't linear, and a lot of this you have to really feel yourself. If you hear someone talk about it and you haven't experienced it, it can seem very foreign and it can seem almost too woo-woo to be able to understand it. But a great book is Your Body Keeps the Score, and that talks about how we have the ability to store trauma, and it is a protective mechanism in the body. And for a lot of people, and even as you grow up, trauma is completely different from one person to another. You could have two twins who have grown up the exact same way, who have had the exact same parents, who obviously have had different life scenarios and life events that they've experienced, go through a big trauma, and one of them can process it okay, and the other one might get stuck into PTSD or have another mental issue that develops from it. So it is always very nuanced and it is subjective as well. You may have gotten beaten up by your parents when you were younger, and I may have gotten yelled at by my parents when I was younger, and I may have actually got a bigger emotional or trauma wound than you have. And that's another one that's hard for people to conceptualize because they're like, oh, I don't think I had that many bad things happen to me when I was younger, but our mind is completely irrational at that age. And a lot of the way that we process the world is determined by our relationship with our parents. It is by the love languages that our parents had. It is by the attachment styles that we develop from a young age. And our first intimate relationship will then usually either double down on that or it will completely reverse it. It'll get to
Mm.
the stage where you might have the ultimate partner at a young age, and then everyone else seems like a downgrade in terms of how they make you feel emotionally after that. Or you might have a terrible one that then makes you have a avoidant or an anxious attachment style that then impacts your future relationships as well. So that's really important to understand. And when you begin to do that work, you start to see, okay, yeah, now I've sort of peeled back layers of the onion. I've got all these foundational pillars of health in place, but there's still this issue. There's just still this feeling that I'm not me or that I'm disconnected from my purpose, or I still feel like I can't sleep. I still feel like I have low energy. And that's where doing some body-based practices can be great, like kinesiology, like seeing an energy healer, like going down, I guess, more of the traditional Chinese medicine pathway and starting to talk about, okay, how does this reflect in chi? Is it stagnant? Is it flowing? And the really cool stuff about that is that has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And even if you think about the chakras in Hinduism and you think about the Buddha and Buddhism, like those concepts have been around forever. And they're all about balance and they're all about harmony and they're all about integrating yourself and your being into nature. And that's where most people are lacking. And because we've become so dissociated from it, and now more than ever with phones and blue light and the numbing of our dopamine levels, we've really lost that connection to ourselves and that connection to what is deeper and what our
Mm.
purpose is. So that does mean that we kind of go into autopilot. And when we're in autopilot, we're not really able to feel into what's coming up. And then when you do get to that stage of doing the work and addressing the fundamentals and healing and getting better, sometimes you can go like backwards, it may feel like. But what's happening is as you feel better, you begin to have that awareness come back in. You begin to feel into your body more and more. And then you realize, holy shit, there's been all this stuff that I've suppressed for years and years and years. And it's now finally coming to the surface and it feels overwhelming or it feels scary. So that's where having the different tools, having someone guide you through that process is so important because, yeah, we can be our own worst enemy or we can be our own biggest cheerleader. But usually it tends to be the first one when you start off, and being able to understand how you can get out of those rigid ways of thinking and those belief systems is critical because yeah, if you don't believe you're going to heal, if you don't believe you deserve to be happy and healthy, then it's never going to manifest in the body. And the mind can be very limiting from that perspective. So, yeah, that component is huge. That is, as I said at the start, the nervous system and the mindset and the emotions, they're right up there alongside the circadian side of things in terms of the first things that need to be addressed because they're so powerful. And then moving on long term, it's about shifting from okay, there's a bunch of stuff here that we've found that has been, I guess, painful or has hurt us in our life. We've been able to heal from it. How do we now get to the point of creating with our thoughts through manifestation, through really getting into the idea of elevating your consciousness and your spirit, which is, yeah, that's the really cool stuff for people to
Mm.
get to.
Yeah, I mean, my cousin, she does sound frequency healing. So she works with people to release negative thoughts, negative emotions through the power of sound frequency. And I think that's really interesting because people talk about like quantum health, like Jack Cruz talks about like quantum health, light water magnetism, but I think sound could be the fourth pillar of that that isn't really spoken as
Mm.
much about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sound, frequency, and vibration. There's an awesome book that I'd suggest for you to check out. It's called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. It's about the mechanisms of consciousness by a scientist back in the 1970s. And that's exactly it. Like those sound frequencies have the ability to penetrate the different tissue layers. They have the ability to hit different chakras based on the notes. That's why binaural beats, for example, can help shift our brain waves into alpha, into beta, into theta, into delta. And yeah, I've had numerous sound healing sessions, and it's really really powerful to be able to drop into that and feel it into the body. So yeah, that's so cool that she's
Mm.
doing that.
And then what another question I had was I hear a lot of people in the not to bring them up again, but the repeat community, they talk about like reducing stress. People like Veronica on Twitter, they talk a lot about how we should be in a low stress environment, like as little stress as possible. Would you say that's different from like your sort of philosophy on stress? Is there a difference between, say, avoiding stress altogether versus allowing your body to adapt to stress and handle stress more effectively so that it doesn't negatively affect you? Would you say that's two like opposing schools of thought?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to be very, very nuanced. There are literally some people that can't tolerate stress because of their deficiencies, either psychologically or physically in their body. But for the most part, as I said, like humans are very resilient creatures, and stress is a good thing acutely. Chronically, it becomes a bad thing and a damaging thing. And understanding where those chronic stresses are, and unfortunately now they're so unknown because of the EMFs, because of the blue light, because of the toxins that we're exposed to all the time, that we kind of are getting that chronic toxin load, and it's almost impossible to avoid it. So it's really important to lean onto those different tools and those different techniques that you can do that help optimize the way that your body's handling stress. It's never a good idea to tell someone that they need to stop stressing or they need to reduce their stress. It's how can you optimize your system to better deal with stress and to mitigate the effect that stress has on you, whether that be physically or whether that be psychologically and emotionally.
So again, it comes down to things like breath work, lymphatic drainage, myofascial release, sound frequencies, all of these techniques that can like it's not about reducing or eliminating stress altogether. It's about allowing your body to handle it better.
Yeah,
Mm,
exactly. And even if you just think of it more from more of a relationships perspective as well, like if you're just constantly in an echo chamber where everyone's agreeing with you and there's no one that you have an argument with, you're not really going to continue to grow, are you? Like the way that we grow is via being challenged and having to adapt. And in relationships, if you're around other people that sometimes you don't agree with, they can be mirrors back to you on where you need to continue to level up and grow. So yeah, I do believe on all aspects you do want to be able to have stresses in your life because they allow you to continue to grow and adapt. But it is that chronic amount that can be really damaging for people to experience.
Mm. And you could argue that the reason people suffer from chronic stress is some of them might not have ever experienced any sort of form of acute stress or hormetic stress. So once they're faced with the burden of heavy chronic stress, they just don't know how to handle it. They haven't adapted their system or built themselves up to tolerate it, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And
Mm,
that's why a lot of people say they love ice baths so much, not just for the physiological benefits it gives them, but for their capacity to deal with stress. And we've kind of created people in the world now that are so sensitive that they can't handle stress even on a conversational level.
mm.
So, yeah, being able to understand how that all fits into your story is really important. And then know that, yeah, the stresses are going to come, but how can you really be in a state to handle it and understand what it's trying to teach you? But the main thing is knowing that it's not like stress is also subjective. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is on your mind all the time that you're like pulling your hair out about. It may be those ones that are in the background creeping up, the EMFs, the blue light, the toxins, the tap water. It may be the physical stresses around you. It may be the emotional or the psychological stresses. So yeah, there's different types of stress, and that all adds up to what is called your allostatic load. And your allostatic load is that big stress bucket. How much of those different avenues of stress can you handle before it actually tips over and affects you? So being able to keep that, I guess, as strong as possible, that's the key.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, ultimately, it comes down to there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that you can't control, whether it's people in your life, like relationships. So, like, you could just start with what you can control, like the blue light, the EMFs, the circadian rhythm stuff, and then once you've dialed all that in, I think a lot of the other stressors in your life, like you'll become a lot better at handling them because you're not bombarded with all of these external stressors from your environment, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also just that mental component of it as well, where the more aware you are of those things, the more stressful they become. Like if you know that you're going to do something, like if you're going to go on a plane and you know all the damages of the reactive oxygen species and the hypoxia and the non-native EMFs that are around you, if you go into that experience knowing that, you're going to stress yourself out even more. So that's where knowing what is in your control and what you can really have an impact on is important. And that's where you prioritize your time. The things that are out of your control, you need to learn the art of letting go of those types of things. But it's usually, yeah, the mind that becomes the trap. And even from an emotional perspective, when you're feeling anxious, for example, it's not the anxiety that's the issue. It's the anxiety of having anxiety, or it's the
Mm.
perception of anxiety that becomes the issue. And that is the field of psychoneuroimmunology, the way that our thoughts have the capacity to impact the cell signaling that is going on. So, yeah, that's why the mind is so important and being able to integrate that into all the different practices for the body.
Oh, 100%. But yeah, this was a great conversation. I learned a lot about, and I hope our listeners learn a lot about this too, like stress, nervous system, fascia, lymphatic drainage, and all that. Like, yeah, I think once you begin to understand all of this, it sort of is like the last piece of the puzzle. People have like diet, training, circadian rhythm, but I think, yeah, like gut health, but I think stress, nervous system, trauma, like I think that really completes the puzzle when it comes to all things holistic health. So yeah, thanks for coming on. And where can our listeners find you?
No worries, mate. That's been a very fun conversation. Uh, you can find me at Jordan_Davey on Instagram, and my website is jordan@jordandavey.com. And then my school is Organic Optimization, which you can find where I go pretty deep into these concepts and offer mentoring as well.
Brilliant. So yeah, guys, make sure to check out Jordan's Instagram and all of his stuff. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope everyone enjoyed that episode. And yeah, we'll see you next time. If you enjoyed that episode of the Ancestral Cure podcast, please give it a like, give it a comment, and share it to your friends. Your support means so much to me here, and thank you all for listening.